I feel like Hamnet is one of those novels that seems almost impossible to adapt because it's so inward and intimate. And usually, when I really love a book, the film can't quite touch what the reading created in my mind. But this film did. Not because it recreates the story beat for beat, but because it understands what the story is really about and it translates that emotional truth into something visual and communal. So today I want to talk about why Hamnet on screen works so well, what the film keeps, what it changes, and why those choices matter. Super brief synopsis. This story follows the life of the Shakespeares, but centers Shakespeare's wife, commonly known as Anne Hathaway, but in the book and in the film, she's referred to as Agnes because that is what her family would have referred to her as. We never get William Shakespeare's name at all in the novel, even though we understand the entire time that we're talking about William Shakespeare. And in the film, we only get a reference to his name towards the very end. The death of their son, Hamnet, is the key tragic event in this story, which is about how the family processes grief, especially the mother. And it's visceral, it's gut-wrenching, especially since we're dealing with the death of a child. This film is one of the most true-to-book adaptations that I've ever seen. Maggie O'Farrell, the author of Hamnet, collaborated on the screenplay for this, and I think it shows. I should note that not all authors are good at crafting screenplays, and I don't hold the view that the quality of a film adaptation hinges upon how closely the film mirrors the book. It just so happens that this film does rather closely mirror the book, and that it also just happens to be a really wonderful adaptation. So then what is it that makes this adaptation so successful in my view? Let's start by talking about the visuals. Most of the narrative takes place in the countryside of Stratford, and there's such a sense of place, both in the bare bones home that they live in, as well as in the lush landscape. Agnes's character is notably tied to nature, and there's just so much green in this film. And also a sense of quiet. I feel like there are plenty of outdoor scenes in this movie where it really gives nature kind of like time to breathe and you can kind of sit with it. And then Agnes's red dress beautifully contrasts with all of that green while still feeling like part of the landscape because it's kind of a muted earthy red. The scenes inside the home make you feel like you're there, kind of like you know the squeak that one plank of wood makes every time that you step on it. It's very real, it feels very material, and that's partly the set design, but it's also partly just the way that the characters interact with the space. The same is true of the London scenes because the city feels very vibrant, but also gritty, gray, a little bit claustrophobic, which serves as a really great contrast to the much more lush, open landscapes that we get in the Stratford scenes. Another random thing that I appreciated is just the fact that people's faces look like they actually belong in this time period. And I do feel like that's become more and more of an issue with a lot of period films lately, that it's easy to get taken out of the immersion when the actor looks like they have to belong in the 21st century. We've all heard of the term iPhone face. Nobody has iPhone face in this movie, and that was nice. In any case, to sum up, all the visuals are really beautifully rendered and feel really grounded. The other key strength of this movie for me was simply the acting. I thought that every single actor in this film was phenomenal, starting with the two leads. So Jessie Buckley, I believe, is the name of the actress who plays Agnes. And I had seen her in one other film where she plays a very different type of character, and she was phenomenal in both. And then Paul Mescal, I believe is the name of the actor. I had never seen him in anything before, so this was my introduction to him, even though I did recognize his face from something. But he was just wonderful, and I cannot remember which YouTuber said this. I believe it was a YouTube video I saw at some point that talked about how he's really good at playing the hot sad guy, so that must be a role that he takes on in other films as well. Have no idea, but he's certainly successful at playing the hot sad guy in this movie. And then I also want to note the children. All of them were amazing, and they really are kind of the heart of the story because you need to feel that pain that the parents feel when Hamnet passes away. And the actor, Noah Jupe, I believe his name is, who plays the little Hamnet, is just amazing. I had never seen him in anything before, but he just felt like such a real child. Like, it did not feel like he was acting at all. It very much felt like this was his actual family. and he was actually sick, and all of this was actually happening to him. Your heart just aches for this little boy. And then there's also the little girl. I don't know the actress's name. I'll write it up on the screen. But she plays Judith, and even though she doesn't get quite as much screen time as Hamnet, she is also very impactful every time that she's on screen. There's a scene in the film when she is allowed to have a look at Hamnet's dead body in order to kind of get that closure. And she asks if that's really him because she can't quite believe it. And she says it doesn't look like him. And her voice cracks on that line and it just like breaks your soul. Okay, sadly, I'm done with my hot cocoa at this point, but we're going to move on to talking about what some of the differences were between the film and the book. For starters, I think this is the biggest one. It's just kind of the narrative structure of the film. So in the book, we get jumping back and forth in time. So we have a lot of flashback, whereas in the film, they decided to just go with a chronological storytelling. I think that this makes sense as a choice for the film, because you have much more limited time to tell the story. And the jumping back and forth that works very successfully in the book, I think would have made the film probably feel a little bit disjointed. The second biggest change, in my opinion, is the fact that we get a lot more of William working away in London and dealing with his grief in the film than we do in the book. Now, the book does imply that he is using his art, his writing, and his acting to process his grief. But we spend all of that time with Agnes, and she is angry with him for being away in London, working, keeping his mind off of things, when she is home, left alone to deal with that grief. In the film, we get a couple of added scenes with William Shakespeare, one of which shows him rehearsing with the actors for the play Hamlet. And he's being kind of like a taskmaster with one of the actors, namely the one who's playing Hamlet. And he keeps asking him to repeat the line over and over and over again. He doesn't feel like he's getting it quite right. And at one point he says, "You're just mouthing the words." And it's very clear when you're watching the film that that specific line is something that he feels very deeply. And he can hear the actor acting it instead of actually feeling it, because Shakespeare himself actually feels it. Then we also get a scene in which Shakespeare, William, I don't know what we're calling him because you don't actually get his name for most of the film, even though we know who we're talking about, but he's standing at the edge of the Thames and he is considering whether or not to actually end his life. And in that moment, he recites a little part of the "to be or not to be" speech, which is a speech that is about that kind of like suicidal ideation. But in the context of this story, it's connected to the incredible level of sorrow and grief that Shakespeare himself is dealing with. So basically, with the book, we understand that he must be grieving in his own way, but in the film, we actually see him grieve. Importantly, in the film, Agnes is still the central character. So we're still mostly seeing from her perspective. It's just that we get a little bit more of William's perspective as well. And I think that that's a good choice for the film, particularly because you have two incredible actors. Let's give them both a chance to really shine. And we also get more scenes in London. And so since in the film, we're not going kind of back and forth in the timeline, it makes sense to move a little bit back and forth between locations because it breaks up the monotony a little bit and kind of helps with the pacing. So I would say those are the two major changes. I think there's a few little minor changes that are worth noting, so let's talk about those as well. Now, in the book, it's implied that William is probably having some affairs while in London. Agnes gets a strong sense that that's probably happening after one of his long stints in London, and we tend to trust her intuition. But with the book, we have time to kind of process and think about what that might mean in the larger context of this story. So, for instance, is William using this as yet another coping mechanism, right? Trying to temporarily forget the sorrow that he's living with. Not that we excuse the behavior, right? Just that we might be able to like understand why this is happening, given that in the story, it's so clearly that he's like very much in love with his wife. We have time to process that in the book, but I think that in the film, it would kind of overcomplicate things. And the film wants to sort of squarely stay rooted in the death of Hamnet and the repercussions that that has on each of the family members. So I don't think that we've really lost anything by removing that detail from the plot in the film. Another scene that's cut from the film is this really cool little interlude in the book in which we have a little travelogue of the flea, following it from Egypt all the way to Stratford. And this is the flea that's responsible for infecting Hamnet. I think that it would have been really difficult to figure out where in the film to put that, and that it would have felt like a really random tonal shift. It is done effectively in the book. I don't think it could have been done as effectively in the film, even though I'm sad to see it go. But I think that the film does try to incorporate a version of that, or a little nod to that scene, by showing William watching a little puppet show that is showing how the plague travels on trade ships. I like the way that they do it because it also creates a little play within the play. There's already a play within the play because towards the end we're watching Hamlet be performed in the movie Hamnet, just as in the book. But this is another mini play within the play. And we probably know that in the actual play of Hamlet, there is also a play within that play. So Hamlet hires a group of actors to act out the murder of his father and to see how his uncle reacts in order to be able to confirm if he is in fact guilty. So I think that that's also, perhaps I'm over analyzing it, but that seems to be a nod to that narrative device as well, which I like. Now, in addition, in the film is when William and Agnes first meet. At this point, we're calling him the Latin tutor. She asks him to tell her a story, and he tells her the ancient Greek myth of Orpheus. William is presented at this stage as being kind of socially awkward, so this allows him a moment of connection with Agnes through his skill of storytelling, which he then later also uses his art to process his grief. So I like this addition as another example of art acting as a vessel. Lastly, the final scene in both the book and the film is Agnes walking in unannounced to the first ever stage production of Hamlet. In the book, we get one scene from Hamlet, but in the film, we actually get a lot more of the play. In both, we get the same opening scene of Hamlet in which William plays the ghost of Hamlet's father, and Hamlet makes his first entrance looking exactly like little Hamnet, but grown up. Here's a quote from the novel for that scene, which I think exemplifies the strength of Maggie O'Farrell's writing. "An arm's length away, perhaps two, is Hamlet, her Hamlet, as he might have been, had he lived, and the ghost, who has her husband's hands, her husband's beard, who speaks in her husband's voice." There's something about the use of commas here that mirrors the breathlessness that Agnes might have felt in that moment. So we get that scene from the play in both the book and the film, but in the movie we also get a sword fighting scene, which is really fitting because in the film, little Hamnet is just unconsolable when his dad has to leave for London, and he loves to play fight with swords with his dad at home. And so his mother consoles him by telling him that she sees in his future him on stage with his dad acting and play fighting with a sword. And this is especially sad because we understand this to be an actual vision that Agnes is having because we know that she can kind of see the future. She's a bit of a seer, but we now realize at the end that the vision she had was her mistaking that young man who looks so much like her little boy to actually be her little boy, but he's no longer with us. Then we forward to the death scene in the film from the play Hamlet, and this is really powerful visually because in this moment, Agnes reaches out to literally touch Hamlet's hand, the actor's hand. So she breaks the fourth wall, and in doing so, she really touches the actor. And he looks out at her, he looks out at the crowd, and suddenly everybody in the crowd is reaching out a hand. So it's this moment of personal catharsis for Agnes and also from backstage for William, but it has clearly had a strong emotional impact on everybody else in the theater. And so it has become this universal communal experience. And there's like an odd sense of comfort in that. Everybody is grieving for her Hamnet. So this leads me to a final note on the movie-going experience because I got to watch this in a movie theater. When I truly love a book, I rarely feel as strongly about any film adaptation because the experience of reading a book is so quiet and internal that it usually feels deeply personal when a book impacts you. Whereas with a film, it rarely measures up because it never paints the exact picture that you imagined in your mind while you were reading that book in the privacy of your own brain. Now, going to the movies is a collective experience, so it doesn't usually feel quite as personal for me. But when a story moves an entire group of people all in the same space together, there is something really special about that a book can't quite create on its own. Everyone in the movie theater was a sobbing mess by the end of this film. I was sitting next to my dad. He was crying. I was crying. As the lights started to turn on, I looked around and everybody was crying. And I think that it doesn't have to be a tragedy, like whether it makes you sad or happy. I think that good art and good literature in particular captures something universal about the human experience. And when you look around and you see everybody being affected in the same way that you have been affected, it is kind of like, to some degree, we're all the same. And there's a collective catharsis in that. This kind of moment of walking into a room as individuals, but then walking out as a group, loosely united by this one shared experience. I think that's what's great about going to the movies. It's also what's great about seeing a live play. So I think that watching it in a theater with everyone crying kind of mirrored the experience of the playgoers in the film and in the book. So I'm really glad that I got a chance to see it in a theater. So that's Hamnet, book and film. If you guys saw the film or read the book or did both, I would love to hear your thoughts about any one of the two or comparing the two in the comments section. Thank you so much for joining me. See you next time. Bye-bye.